Sanda Dia was an ambitious and intelligent young guy who was ready to make his own way in the world and make his family proud. After 2 years in university, he decided to join an exclusive fraternity, but in order to do so, he had to be initiated in the most horrific way, through a brutal hazing. This is when a new club member is forced to do things that humiliate them, that degrade them. It's often abuse, and these things put these people in danger. Even if they don't want to do it, they have to if they want to be a part of the club. So in 2018, Sanda Dia was driven out to an isolated cabin hidden deep inside the forest, and 18 of these club members made him do awful, unspeakable things. He was made to sit in ice-cold water for hours, eat live animals. After almost 48 hours of horrible torture, Sanda's organs began to fail. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was already too late. The 18 members of this elite student club did everything they could to hide the details of what happened to Sanda. They used all of their privilege to manipulate the system so that no one would ever discover the truth. But when it comes to justice, does money always win? Can a group of elite, wealthy students really get away with murder? This is the story of Sanda Dia, a bright, funny 20-year-old guy who had his whole life ahead of him. But the Belgian courts never saw that. Instead, they saw the son of an immigrant, and 18 white boys whose influential families needed this scandal hidden away for good. This series is intended for educational purposes, to memorialise victims and to amplify important conversations. All opinions stated are mine alone. Before we dive into this episode, I want to thank our sponsor for making it possible, NordVPN. If you're a regular here on the Eleanor Neale channel, you already know what NordVPN do, and you already know how much I love them. I ride for you, NordVPN. That was a Charlie XCX and Lord reference, I'm sorry. And that's because I cannot say it enough that in 2024, you need a VPN using the internet. It's a scary place out there, and NordVPN has been my choice for keeping all of my information, all of my data safe for years now, nearly 5 years. Their app is so quick and easy to download to pretty much any of your devices, your phone, your tablet, your PC, your laptop, and one account can protect up to 6 devices. And I feel like this kind of protection is absolutely essential. I put all my friends and family onto a VPN because the scams are getting more and more believable. It's scary. I actually just got an email the other week that looked like it was from my bank. Like, everything looked authentic. And I actually called them up and I was like, is this real? And they were like, no, thank God you called up. Could you imagine if I'd have clicked a link on there or something? Thank God I had a VPN enabled, and thank God I didn't click it anyway. These scammers will pretend to be someone that you trust, like your bank, and then they will trick you into spilling over all of your billing details so that they can steal all of your money or all of your information. And it genuinely can be really hard to tell the difference sometimes. I mean, I nearly fell victim to it, and this is why having a VPN enabled is so important. But NordVPN have so many different features that help to protect you in so many different ways. Like, they have their threat protection feature that can identify these dodgy links and warn you about dangerous websites. They also have a password manager, and God knows I need that because I have the memory of a sieve and I have so many important passwords. They can help you to come up with super complex passwords that no one's ever gonna guess, and then they go in this very secure password manager that no one can access but you. And you know what? Even if it isn't for internet safety, a VPN is so useful in the way of entertainment. I have always used NordVPN to access different streaming service libraries from different countries. You could pay for just one streaming service, for example, Netflix, but every country has a different Netflix library. So you could use your VPN to virtually travel to these different countries and see what movies they've got. There are so many reasons, not only to get a VPN, but to use Nord specifically, because they have so many extra features. I've already listed you a few, but another one of my favorites is NordLocker, which is basically a locker for all of your important files, keeping them locked down against anyone that wants to access them. And I could keep listing all of the different features that they have, but why don't you go and discover them for yourself? Internet safety is more important now than it ever has been. And lucky for you guys, NordVPN are giving my audience an exclusive deal when you click the link down below in the description. That's nordvpn.com/Eleanor, and it's 100% risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, every purchase of a 2-year plan will receive 4 bonus months on top, and a Saley data voucher worth up to 20 gigabytes. Saley is basically this new eSIM app that provides an internet connection wherever you travel, meaning that you save money on roaming fees. It's brilliant. I mean, I've only just kind of heard of it and I'm really excited to use it. So thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this episode. Before we jump into the case, I want to warn you that in this episode we're going to be covering a lot of sensitive topics, including discussions of torture, racism, assault, violence, vomit, and murder, so viewer discretion is always advised. Now, it's time to unmask the levels of injustice behind Sanda Dia's tragic death. On a gloomy December afternoon in 2018, 20-year-old Sanda Dia was selling roses on the cobblestone streets of Leuven in Belgium. It was the first day of his initiation, or baptism as they call it in Dutch, into an elite student club at his university. From the outside, it looked like an innocent, silly, playful little task, you know, going out selling roses, but this was only the beginning. The initiation was set to become far more sinister. This was the start of a brutal and dehumanizing hazing process that lasted almost 48 hours and ended tragically with Sanda's death. To become a member of a fraternity like the one that Sanda was joining, members have to go through a series of initiation rituals called hazing. It's seen as a way to build bonds between members and to prove your loyalty to the club, but it can also be a breeding ground for toxic masculinity and abuse. Hazings can get really sick and twisted in a lot of cases. It often involves physical and emotional abuse, and things can very quickly go horribly wrong. Just days after Sanda was seen smiling and handing out roses on the streets of Leuven, his family and friends were now laying roses on his grave. Meanwhile, the 18 members of this elite student club were doing everything they possibly could to cover up the truth about what happened to Sanda Dia. His story begins 20 years earlier in the quiet suburb of Reuzegom in Antwerp, a Flemish-speaking region of Belgium. Just a warning, you're gonna have to be patient with my pronunciation in this video. As always, I'll try my best, but as always, I'm gonna warn you that it's probably not gonna be great. Sanda Dia was born on April 9th, 1998. His father, Ousmane Dia, was from Senegal, and his mother, Annemie Devel, was from Belgium. His father came to Belgium in 1994 as an asylum seeker, and this was 4 years before Sanda would be born. His dad settled in Antwerp and made it his new home. There he found work in a truck factory, he learned Dutch, and he met his future wife, Annemie. Their two different cultures came together to create a very warm and loving household, and Sanda had a very typical Belgium upbringing. He lived in a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, he studied Latin at school, and he played football. Football is very, very popular over in Belgium. All the lads played it, and Sanda was very good at it, actually. He joined a football club with his best friend Robrecht, and he absolutely adored Sanda. He said that Sanda always had such a positive outlook on life. He was always smiling, he was always laughing, cracking jokes. He was a very funny guy, apparently. But not only was Sanda kind, funny, lovely, friendly, but he was also incredibly ambitious. He was hardworking and very intelligent. He was one of those people that is just naturally good at everything. Not only is he great at academics and like all his maths and English and science, but he's also great at sport. And you know, there's people that can sing as well and dance. They're like a 700 trick pony. He was one of those. As a teenager, Sanda was obsessed with anime. He loved Japanese culture. It was actually his dream to move to Tokyo one day so that he could fully immerse himself in that culture and learn more about it. He'd built a close-knit friendship group in his life, friends friends that had been around him since secondary school, and this included his best friend, Robrecht. But growing up in this very small Flemish suburb meant that Sanda was one of the only black students in his whole entire school, and he was sadly very aware that he would face more challenges in life because of the colour of his skin. Like many European countries, Belgium has a very dark and violent colonial past, especially in the Congo. The extent of the horrors couldn't even be covered in a 6-hour-long special episode, but to give you some very brief context, just over 100 years ago, King Leopold II plundered the Congo Free State like it was his own personal playground of exploitation and brutality. About 10 million Congolese people died from killings, starvation, disease, and even the ones that got away with their lives, many of them would have their hands literally cut off, even some children, if they couldn't meet Leopold's work quotas. In the early 1900s, Belgian Parliament was forced to make him give up power after several other countries got involved calling out this depravity. And it would actually be another 50 plus years before the Congo actually gained independence from Belgium. That happened in 1960. And unfortunately, the impact of this brutal colonial history is still felt today in present-day Belgium in a very structural and institutionalized way. It's much harder for people of colour with non-European names to be able to rent apartments over there, or to access certain job opportunities, or to get loans from banks. There's even some very controversial traditions like Zwarte Piet. If you don't know, Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete, is a tradition from the 19th century that still continues to this day in the Netherlands and Belgium. Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete, is a character. He is the helper of St. Nicholas, comes out at Christmas time, you know, and people dress up as him in blackface, with an afro wig, big red lips, and gold hoops in their ears. The countries that love this tradition have populations that are around 80% white, so it's white people doing this. And this means that every year, this basically teaches racism to the kids that are there for the Christmas parades, and it sticks with the population as they grow up. A lot of people in Belgium and the Netherlands try to defend this tradition, saying that its intentions are innocent, without acknowledging how harmful it actually is. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of comments on this video because of the way that I'm talking about it. I'm sure there's going to be a debate, but the fact of the matter is, every December, when people are using and defending blackface, it only perpetuates the mistreatment and marginalisation of black people. And it's honestly really fucking sad. And I give all of this context because I think it's important to understand what Sanda probably experienced growing up, and all of the extra challenges that he had to deal with that his white friends likely never even thought about. But despite all of this, Sanda Dia was always such a bright, optimistic, happy fellow, and it served him well for his very short life. In 2016, he was accepted at KU Leuven, which is the best ranked university in Belgium, and he was going there to study civil engineering. This was a huge deal because Sanda was about to be the first person in his whole entire family to go to university. By this point, his parents had divorced, but they were still so over the moon with how successful and intelligent their son already was at such a young age, especially his dad. To this day, Usman still says that Sanda is his best friend. They were just so incredibly proud of him, being the son of an immigrant and managing to get into the most prestigious university in the country. It made it such a bigger achievement. It just shows all of the barriers that Sanda had to break down and all of the work that he put in to overcome these really unfair challenges. Him getting into this university was proof that his father's sacrifices in life were paying off and opening new doors for his son. Sanda was always trying to find ways to show his gratitude to his father and repay him in some kind of way, and getting into this prestigious university was payment enough. It made his father so proud he could have just burst. And going to KU Leuven was supposed to be just the beginning for Sanda Dia. He wanted to make a huge positive impact on the world. He wanted to go far in life and be really successful at whatever he set his mind to. So, as he was going into his third year of university, Sanda started to think more seriously about his future beyond education. He knew that he needed to be making connections right now with other young people that would help him later on in his life. So, he decided to join a student club that would hopefully open a whole load more doors for him. One day, Sanda and his best friend Robrecht were playing football at their football club when they made friends with a few other boys who were part of this elite student club named Reuzegom. I'm possibly pronouncing that wrong. You don't want to know how many times I've watched pronunciation videos on that. It wasn't the whole of Reuzegom that they met. It was only a few of the lads, including their only non-white member. And this kind of opened Sanda's eyes a bit, made him realise that, well, if that guy could be in the group, then there's no reason that he couldn't be. The thought of joining Reuzegom was exciting, intriguing, inspiring, an opportunity not to be missed. So Sanda decided to go for it. Reuzegom was a fraternity that was set up in 1946 for a specific group of lads in a school in Antwerp, and it hasn't changed much at all from its beginnings. Their members are still very rich, elite, powerful people, and they are pretty much all white. Plus, they have a reputation, and have always had this reputation, for being ignorant and misogynistic and racist and homophobic. Most people have heard about the American fraternities. They exist in unis pretty much all around the world. Well, apart from here in the UK. We don't have them. So, if you're from the UK, or if you just don't know what a fraternity is, they're basically exclusive clubs where guys will form this close brotherhood. They throw parties and mixers to make even more friends throughout the university, and they're supposed to just support each other through the uni experience. At least that's what it's supposed to be. If you've ever seen the film The Riot Club, then you probably have a good idea of what kind of fraternity Reuzegom is. That film is about a secret-ish fraternity at Oxford University for rich, snobby, and quite frankly, horrible young men, which, by the way, is based on a real society, on a real club. And two of the UK's former prime ministers were a part of that club, David Cameron and Boris Johnson. And we all know the stories about David Cameron in university and that pig. You know the pig. I'm not going to explain that, so I'm really sorry if you don't know what I'm referencing there. Google it at your own risk. In fact, if you've seen episode 1 of Black Mirror, you know. Anyway, the boys in Reuzegom were very rich, their families were tied into very powerful social circles, and too much power and not enough morality is a very, very dangerous mix. At the time of this case, there were 22 members. Most of them were the sons of famous Belgian politicians or CEOs or lawyers, very, very powerful families. And honestly, these are the exact kind of connections that Sanda was looking to make being part of this club. If he was going to grow up to be a very successful pillar of Belgian society, then he wanted other friends that were very successful and powerful in his adulthood. But to become a member of the Reuzegom club, he had to go through a hazing. Hazing is where young lads looking to join these fraternities are expected to be put through absolute hell in order to prove their loyalty, pledge their allegiance to the brotherhood. The newbies that are being hazed are usually forced to do things that will humiliate them, degrade them, abuse them, or put them in danger. Even if they say they don't want to do it, they have to. If they want to be a part of the club, they have to endure this. And it's probably not a surprise that Reuzegom specifically had a reputation for their very secretive and very extreme hazing rituals. Their trademark was actually putting people into pits of freezing cold water for hours at a time. And that can cause hypothermia, yet this was just a regular thing that they did every year to new recruits. And this is nothing like the ice baths that you see athletes or like wellness influencers doing. It wasn't for fun, it wasn't for health, it was actually very, very dangerous. Hypothermia can develop in just 30 minutes of being in very, very cold water. And if you're left there for hours, some very serious health problems can begin. In the weeks following Sanda's death, a lot of Reuzegom's sick, evil, and hidden past was exposed to the public. There was a Facebook photo found from 2007 that had Reuzegom members dressed in KKK costumes. Then in 2013, the fraternity was taken to court by like an animal rights group for abusing and killing a piglet as part of one of their hazing rituals, and each of the members paid €400 as a penalty fee. In fact, I want you to remember that figure, €400 as a penalty fee. It comes back into this case again later, and it adds just another layer of heartbreak and outrage to this case. And none of these incidents that I just mentioned, the piglet or the KKK costumes, none of it actually led to Reuzegom receiving any consequences. They were never shut down. The most they did was pay a €400 penalty each. In 2018, the year that Sanda was killed, the fraternity held elections for who was going to be that year's hazing tamer. The tamer is basically the leader of the hazing. They design the whole hazing process. They decide what new recruits are going to go through, in what order, and for how long it's all gonna last. And pretty much everyone in the group wanted to be the tamer, and so people start putting their pictures in the group chat saying why they should be chosen to be the hazing tamer. In an attempt to gain votes, one of them actually sent a horrifying text message referring to our good German friend Adolf, and he promised to make the hazing crazy brutal for the elite we are. And that guy, who literally referenced Hitler as their good German friend, he was chosen to be the hazing tamer, responsible for Sanda's torture. At Belgian universities, and pretty much all universities really, initiations are like a rite of passage into student clubs, but they're often quite harmless. It's just like silly things like getting an egg cracked on your head and getting flour thrown on you, and of course there's a lot of drinking games. It is university after all. They're meant to be harmless fun. But that's not always how they turn out. In October 2019, a different group at KU Leuven University threw a politically incorrect themed party that turned out exactly how you would imagine. It was racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, all the different ists and phobics that you could imagine. At this party, guests were encouraged to write out their controversial opinions on this big piece of paper, and the things they wrote were just disgusting. There were comments like, Congo was not a genocide because they aren't people. There was another one that said 6 million was not enough in relation to the Holocaust. There was even one that said, when her age is on the clock, she's ready for the cock. And just so many more vile things. That is 3 examples of so many. We found a picture of this piece of paper, and luckily it's in a language that I can't read, so thank God other people translated just a few for me. There's reports of similar things happening all over the world. It's not just in Belgium. But one of the most popular initiation activities in Belgium universities are cantuses. It's a cantus. I tried to make it plural, but I don't know how to pluralize words that are not in my language. Cantus. It's basically a big singing, dancing, drinking event that societies do. It's kind of like a freshers thing. You get given a booklet that'll have like 15 to 25 songs in that everyone's gonna sing that night, and people, apparently, go absolutely wild at these things. I hope our researcher doesn't mind me mentioning that she went to university in one of these countries, and she said, from personal experience, it's insane. Just imagine a ton of alcohol, whole entire pitchers of beer being spilled and thrown all over the place. You are soaking and sticky and smelly, and for days afterwards you cannot get the smell of beer off of you. You feel gross. But it's a great time because it's university. And, you know, we have freshers in the UK. Every year people go too far and have hangovers for a whole entire week afterwards. But it's kind of all part of it, you know? And that's what it's supposed to be. Well, no, that's not what uni is supposed to be. That's what a freshers thing is supposed to be. Fun. Something that you look back on with good memories. Not hazing. Hazing is something that the person will look back on only with trauma. In October 2018, Sanda attended his first ever cantus with the Reuzegom boys. He wasn't a part of Reuzegom at this point. He hadn't gone through the hazing or anything like that, but I think they were in the early stages, you know, they were getting to know him, they were about to invite him. So he goes to his very first cantus, And it was a proper mess, a big fat mess. The fraternity ended up causing thousands of euros worth of damage at the place that they rented out to throw this party. But that's not even the worst part. When a staff member at the venue asked the boys to clean up after themselves, they called Sanda over using a racial slur and told him to do it. The staff member was quite horrified hearing this, and they asked the boys why they were calling Sanda that, and they replied, "Black people have to work for white people." And this alone just shows how toxic and racist and ignorant the culture was within Reuzegom. And it makes me wonder, was that why Sanda was invited to join the club in the first place? Did all of these white boys think they could put him to work for them? Was he just there to clean up after the rest of the group? That same staff member that called out the racism in the other boys then went over to Sanda to kind of make sure that he was okay. And when they asked why Sanda lets them speak to him like that, he just kind of brushed it off. It was like he didn't really have an answer to give this person. That was just how it was. And it's just so heartbreaking to think that Sanda had just gotten so used to this racist behaviour that he didn't even think twice about it. This experience was part of a much bigger pattern of abuse and discrimination. The fact that he seemed to brush it off so easily shows how normal that kind of behaviour had become for him, and he had almost come to expect it. And just 2 months after this Cantus incident, Sanda would tragically die at the hands of the same boys that called him those awful racial slurs. It was a cold, wet Tuesday afternoon in Leuven city centre. At around 4 p.m. on December 4th, 20-year-old Sanda Dia was spotted in a white robe selling roses to people on the street. He looked as though he was having fun. He was smiling brightly, he was friendly with everyone walking by, but what seemed like an innocent, fun little activity was actually the first game in his official hazing into Reuzegom. The first challenge was the lowest stakes challenge, selling roses in the street. Maybe it's a little bit embarrassing, but it's nothing really, is it? Sanda was out there selling roses, competing against 2 other boys, 2 other newbies to Reuzegom. They were all going through hazing at the same time, and they were all competing with each other to see who could sell the most roses. And actually, the person that sold the least amount of roses would then have the hardest hazing to follow. Sanda ended up selling 30 roses less than the other boys, and so he was set to face the most brutal hazing of all 3 of them. As a forfeit for losing this rose challenge, Sanda was made to drink a lot of alcohol. We couldn't quite find out how much. Later on, as we keep going, we have found measurements, but at this point we're not sure how much he drank, but it must have been a hell of a lot, and you will see as we keep going. By the late afternoon, Sanda was very, very drunk. He was quite out of it, and he could barely talk. Even when people were asking him questions, he could do nothing but slur a jumble of sounds back to them. At about 7 p.m. that evening, they returned to the fraternity house, which was only a few streets away from where they'd been selling roses. And once Sanda walked in through that door, he collapsed. And he couldn't move. So now he couldn't walk and he couldn't talk. But the Reuzegom boys weren't going to let him tap out that easy. No, these arseholes had already decided that it was time for the next stage of hazing, whether Sanda was physically capable or not. It just baffles me that these boys insisted that they considered Sanda a friend, almost a brother in their fraternity, yet they see him in such a dangerous state already, and they're deciding to push it even further. They didn't give him a sip of water or a bite of food to try to soak up the alcohol, they just left him. Sanda eventually pulled himself up off the ground and vomited everywhere, which is actually a good thing, given the amount of alcohol that he had ingested. The fact that his body is trying to get rid of it and, successfully vomiting, I mean, it's a slight good thing. But the Reuzegom boys were going to make him replace all of that alcohol in his system, because the next phase of the hazing was actually a bit of a question round. All these 3 newbies, including Sanda, were asked a series of questions. I'm not sure what kind of questions, but if they got the answer wrong, they had to drink. And it wasn't just like, do a shot or take a sip of your drink. No, these boys were making him pick up the whole entire bottle and swig it straight from the bottle. At this point, surely we're reaching alcohol poisoning territory. In fact, I'm sure we're past that, because at this point he was showing a lot of the symptoms, not being able to talk or walk, involuntarily projectile vomiting everywhere. That is his body screaming out for help. But still, none of the boys gave a shit. They kept asking Sanda questions, and whenever he would get them wrong, he would drink, and in total, he had to drink a bottle and a half, a whole entire bottle and a half of gin. Straight gin. And that was in such a short space of time too. He eventually passed out again. He was lying comatose on the floor. And this is where things escalated. I mean, it sounds pretty damn brutal as is. I'm sure you're thinking, how can this escalate? But oh my God, does it escalate. And the Reuzegom boys decided that they would urinate all over him and just leave him there to fester in it when he can't get himself up, he can't get himself changed. It's disgusting. Around 9 p.m, somehow Sanda managed to get up and they all left the house, all of the boys, including the 3 newbies, and they went to another cantus. But pretty much as soon as they arrived, Sanda and the other 2 newbies were like knocked out from all of the alcohol they had been forced to ingest in that day, an inhumane amount of alcohol. Again, they were like lying on the ground in this club, not speaking to anyone, unable to pick themselves up and walk, but still no one seemed to care. By the end of the night, all 3 of them were laying on the ground near the exit of the party, being repeatedly urinated on again and again. Around midnight, Sanda Dia finally made it back to his bedroom. But the hazing wasn't over yet. When he stumbled inside, a very drunk Sanda found that all of the taps in his room had been sealed over, so he wasn't able to drink any water. For the rest of the night, and in fact into the next day, Sanda and the 2 newbies that had been forced to drink so much alcohol, they will have been so dangerously dehydrated, they were having water withheld. Under no circumstances was anyone in Reuzegom allowed to give these boys a drop of water. This hazing had clearly already gone way beyond fun and games. Being urinated on and having water withheld is just so evil and so dangerous. Sanda was allowed to go to bed that night. He had survived his first day of hazing. But tomorrow would be a devastatingly different story. The next morning was December 5th, and just after 10 a.m, all 18 members of Reuzegom and the 3 new recruits were ready to leave Leuven for another insane day of hazing. But it looked like Sanda had woken up still very, very drunk. He was still unable to talk really and could barely walk on his own. And it bears repeating, none of them had been able to have a drop of water since before the hazing began the day before. I honestly couldn't think of anything worse than waking up from a normal hangover, from just going clubbing with your mates and not being able to drink water the next morning. I cannot imagine what that must feel like after like 2 liters of alcohol in your system and a whole entire sleep, and then you can't rehydrate in any way. This whole group all drive an hour out of Leuven this day until they arrive at an isolated log cabin in a forest. This is some real horror movie shit at this point. Once they arrived, all 3 newbies were ordered to dig themselves a hole where they would be spending the rest of the afternoon into the evening. It was like these evil boys had made Sanda Dia dig his own grave. Just after midday, one of the members of the group sent a message into their big WhatsApp chat saying, "Freshmen dig in the hole. Sanda already ready for the trash. The other 2 are still okay." So they knew that Sanda wasn't doing well. They could clearly see just how much the hazing and all of those liters of alcohol had affected his health, but they didn't care. It was entertaining to them. They proceeded to fill these 3 pits with cold water, and then they made each of the new recruits submerge themselves in it. By the afternoon, it was absolutely freezing, about 6 degrees Celsius, that is 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and Sanda had already spent hours in this freezing cold water-filled pit. And then they started that awful question game again. This time, if they answered correctly, they could earn themselves a sip of water for the first time in 24 hours. But if they got the questions wrong, now the punishments were about to be way worse than alcohol. It was something way more revolting, seriously sickening, and alive. They released an eel into the water that Sanda was sitting in. It was flitting and flipping about him, and he was told to catch it and bite its head off. And he did it. He kind of had no choice. He was already so deep into this hazing. He was so damaged from the day before. He was so exhausted. Like, he bit the head off this eel. They didn't make him eat it or swallow it, but disgusting. Later that evening, when Sanda got another question wrong, he was forced to swallow a live goldfish, and then the boys made him drink fish oil, hoping that it would make him vomit the fish back up, still alive. Now, if you've ever smelled fish oil before, you will know how strong and horrible that scent is. Just the smell alone could make a lot of people throw up, but when they made Sanda drink a bit of it, he didn't. The boys were waiting around thinking that he was going to throw up, and when he wasn't, they got impatient and they made him drink even more and more and more and more, hoping that at some point he's going to throw up. We don't know exactly how much in total he drank, but the Reuzegom boys had ordered litres of the stuff, and Sanda consumed a very, very unhealthy amount. At this point, he looked just as drunk as he was the night before, but that couldn't have been possible because all day he hadn't been given another drop of alcohol. He wasn't drunk, but he was very, very dazed and dissociating. Clearly the result of all of that fish oil, the hypothermia, the dehydration, and alcohol poisoning, probably. And to make an already awful situation even worse, the Reuzegom boys were continually urinating on him throughout all of this. About 30 minutes later, Sanda was completely out of it. He was passed out now, and instead of trying to get him any kind of help, the boys decided they would try to shock him awake again by pouring 10 buckets of ice-cold water over his head. He was already freezing cold after being sat in that pit of cold water for hours at this point. It was hypothermia level. And for some reason, the Reuzegom boys thought that the answer to this was more cold water. At this point, Sanda wasn't really responding in any way, shape, or form. He was dazed and completely out of it, almost unresponsive. And by 8:17 p.m, things had taken a very serious turn for the worse. He was out of the water now, laying in the fetal position on the ground, hugging himself and making strange noises from the pain that he must have been going through. Some of the Reuzegom boys finally realized how serious this situation was. This wasn't normal. He looked like he was in agonizing pain, and they actually began to panic. Well, only a couple of them began to panic. Meanwhile, inside the isolated cabin that we haven't really talked much about, but that was where a lot of the planning and prep was going down. There were a bunch of Reuzegom boys in there currently trying to blend a dead mouse with dog food, cat food, and more fish oil, and they were going to make him eat this blended concoction. And actually, this next phase of the hazing was not only drinking that disgusting fucking potion, but they were also going to make him bite the head off of a live mouse. It just makes me shudder. Ugh. But all of those plans were put aside when some of the Reuzegom boys ran into the log cabin and told the others about Sanda's current state. He was seriously unhealthy and in a lot of danger. They realised that they'd probably pushed the whole cold water thing a bit too fucking far, and now he clearly had hypothermia. So they tried to resolve this on their own. They dragged him over to the campfire that they'd made earlier in the day, and oh my god, this is a whole thing. Yeah, the Reuzegom boys had made a campfire earlier on in the day, and throughout all of this, as the three newbies were catching hypothermia and eating the fucking head off of an eel in their little dugout graves, The Reuzegom boys were sat around this campfire chilling and laughing and joking. So anyway, they drag Sanda over to this campfire. Doesn't really do anything. And then they realise, shit, we're going to have to do something more. So they go and turn on one of the cars, put the heating on, and they decide to chuck him in there for 5 minutes, hoping that 5 minutes in a heated car would reverse hours in a freezing cold pit of water. They took his wet clothes off of him, they put him some dry ones on, they finally gave him some water to drink. But by this point, it was too fucking late. There had been so much damage done to Sanda's body, his insides, just his physical health was in tatters. And by the way, one of these Reuzegom boys was a medical student. How the hell did he not want to step in when he was seeing these horrific symptoms of ill health and hypothermia, and he just didn't do anything to intervene? This is a person that is training to save people's lives. And he just watched as the life drained out of Sanda Dia. He didn't bother doing anything. It's so fucking concerning to me that you never actually know who the trusted professionals that you trust with your life, you never know who they really are. Maybe the same doctor that is sitting by your bedside in hospital promising you that he is going to do everything he can to save your life. Maybe he's the same guy that took part in a brutal hazing when he was in university that ended in someone's death. But you would never know. And you just have to put your trust and your life in the hands of these people. Just before 9 p.m, it was about 40 minutes after they'd pulled Sanda out of the water pit, put him by the campfire, changed his clothes, put him in the car. He wasn't getting any better. And at this point, they realised they had to take him to the hospital. They called the emergency services on their way to the hospital to let them know that Sanda would be coming in, and they told them that Sanda was very cold and that he'd fainted. And that was all they said. They didn't mention the excessive amount of alcohol they'd forced him to drink the day before, or the fish oil, or the fucking eel that they'd made him bite the head off of, or the fact that they had been withholding water from him for about 24 hours. They conveniently didn't mention any of that. He was just cold and he fainted. They arrived at the hospital within 15 minutes, and as soon as doctors saw Sanda, they panicked. They knew that this was a very, very severe case of hypothermia. And at this point, he'd actually began bleeding from his nose and his mouth. His body temperature had dropped to 27 degrees Celsius, and a normal body temperature is 37. Sanda was 10 degrees colder internally than a human needs to survive and function. And this is actually life-threatening. It's not just dangerous, it's not just concerning, it is a threat to his life that he has become so cold in that pit of water that they made him sit in. After an hour of being in this hospital, they realised that they just didn't have the resources to be able to take on a case like this. And so Sanda was transferred to the University Hospital of Antwerp, which was actually in his hometown. There, they did a bunch of different tests on him, and they actually found that his blood had an extremely high level of salt content. And I'm not 100% sure where that would have come from, whether it's the fish oil, probably, or the alcohol leaving his blood or whatever. Either way, it was very, very dangerous, very, very concerning. And shortly after arriving at that hospital, Sanda slipped into a coma. Meanwhile, back at the isolated log cabin, because a lot of the Reuzegom members had stayed there along with the other two newbies, the hazing was continuing, as if nothing was happening to Sanda, as if he wasn't in a fucking coma in the hospital. They just kept shit going. It's just insane to me that the threat to Sanda's life clearly hadn't affected their desire to keep the torture going. Those boys back at the cabin were made to get back into their freezing cold water pits and to drink more fish oil. The plan for those two was to complete their hazing by making them lay naked in the forest for 2 whole hours at night. As if they weren't already freezing enough. Were they trying to kill these boys? They know at this point in time that Sanda Dia has life-threatening hypothermia. So why on earth would they push it another step further? Eventually, the Reuzegom boys that had gone to the hospital with Sanda got in contact with the Reuzegom boys back at the log cabin. They filled them in on everything, and they all panicked. All of them together at this point, and they decided to halt the hazing on these other 2 boys. At 10:39 p.m, The other 2 newbies had to be taken to hospital. All 3 of them were hospitalized. I'm assuming they all had hypothermia. We know for sure that Sanda did. And I can only imagine that being in that water for that long will do some insane damage to your body. One of these boys stayed in hospital for a whole day and the other one for 2 days. By this point, all 18 of those Reuzegom boys knew that they were in serious trouble, and so they immediately started covering their tracks. They didn't even wait to see if Sanda or the other 2 boys were okay. That night, they just started getting rid of everything. They deleted all the photos and videos of the hazing off of their phones because, yes, they had been documenting all of the pain and abuse and torture that they were putting these boys through. It's like some kind of sick trophy that they would look back on and be able to relive these moments, these videos that would have literally shown the life draining out of Sanda Dia right in front of their eyes. So they deleted all of that. They even deleted their big WhatsApp group chat that they always used and they'd been using to plan and prepare for this hazing. It must have had so much incriminating information in it. In fact, remember that one comment from the hazing tamer himself, his pitch about their good German friend Adolf? It all had to go. It all made them look dangerous and evil. They also did a lot of physical scrubbing as well. They scrubbed up the whole campsite and the whole log cabin. It looked spotless. And in fact, when police eventually went there and found it, they could tell that it had been cleaned down. This is one thing about when people clean up a crime scene after it's been there. There's such thing as too clean, suspiciously clean, and then you just kind of back at square one where they know that there's been a crime committed there. Some of the Reuzegom boys even went back to their house and started scrubbing Sanda's bedroom for some reason, and I couldn't quite figure this out. I don't know if there was like alcohol left over in there. They were probably taking all the tape off of the taps, you know, because they'd been withholding water from him. All of this while he is laying in a coma in hospital with life-threatening hypothermia. His organs were failing. Across town, his childhood best friend, Robrecht, remember the one that he played football with? In fact, the person that he first met the Reuzegom boys with. He was at his own house. In fact, it was quite late at night, obviously, and he was getting ready for bed when suddenly his phone starts blowing up. He's getting texts from loads of people sending him screenshots of what the Reuzegom boys were posting on social media as all of this was going down. They were asking if anyone had Sanda Dia's parents' phone numbers. They were saying that he was in hospital and they needed to contact his family. Robrecht sees this and he panics. His heart drops. That is his best friend. What the fuck has happened to him? Unfortunately, Robrecht didn't have any kind of communication contact lines with Sanda's family, but he did know where his father lived. He jumped in his car and raced straight down to his father's house to tell him in person that his son was in hospital. Of course, at this point, he couldn't tell Usman any more than that because that was all he knew. He didn't know why he was in hospital, what on earth had happened. They were just panicked beyond belief. In fact, Robrecht couldn't wait a single second more. As Usman was trying to get ready for the hospital, Robrecht flew there by himself and Usman was going to meet him there. When Robrecht first arrived at the hospital, he saw 6 of the Reuzegom members just hanging around. They weren't doing much and they didn't say a word to him. But before Usman arrived, which really wasn't that long after, all 6 of them had left. Clearly they knew this was serious. They didn't want to see Sanda's loved ones. They wanted to get the fuck out of there. It's hard to imagine just how terrified Usman will have been feeling at this point in time, not knowing what had happened to his son, just knowing that he had been hospitalized. It was very serious. I guess you'd just be fearing the worst, wouldn't you? And then he walks in and he sees his son, his best friend, his 20-year-old Sanda, who should not be in this position. He is laying in a coma. He should be out having fun with his friends. He was so young and he was so full of life. Yet here he was clinging to his life. When Usman arrived, Robrecht was still there, but actually Usman told him to go home. He didn't want Sanda's best friend to go through all of this stress, and actually Usman would have preferred to just handle all of this on his own as the father. And you know, Robrecht respected that and left, although he was still very, very anxious. 2 days later, despite doctors doing absolutely everything in their power to try to save him, Sanda Dia passed away from multiple organ failure. He was only 20 years old. Robrecht was, of course, back at home trying to keep up his commitments as best as he could, even though his best friend was literally dying in hospital. And then he got the heartbreaking message that informed him that Sanda had finally passed. He was actually at work at the time and he went straight home, but as he was driving, he said he was crying so much that he could barely even see the road through his tears. It was an absolutely heartbreaking loss for his family and for the whole world, honestly. Sanda was such a promising young man in every single way. He had a heart of gold and he was so intelligent, and with those two things together, he could have changed the world. And now, someone was going to have to answer for why he was dead at the age of 20. 20-year-olds in good health don't just fall into a coma and die of multiple organ failure for no reason. The police took the Reuzegom boys in for questioning, and at this point they had completely wiped the internet of themselves. They were off LinkedIn, off Facebook, every other platform. Obviously the WhatsApp group was gone, and all of them had gotten their story straight. These 18 Reuzegom members were all around 20 years old themselves, and they came from some of the most rich, powerful, influential families in the whole of Antwerp. A lot of their parents were part of the legal and corporate elite, and they had managed to hire the best lawyers in the business to defend them. In fact, one of the suspects' mothers was a big judge in that area, so she had a lot of power and influence when it came to the courts. This is the Flemish elite. They band together and protect one another, and this is exactly why we can't let it go. And students in the Netherlands and Belgium didn't let it go. Sanda's case sparked a movement for change across the Netherlands and Belgium and other countries, pretty much all over the world when it came to hazing. The following year, KU Leuven, the university that this all happened under, they decided they needed to make a lot of changes, and thank God. They introduced what was called a baptism charter for all of their fraternities and men's clubs and sports clubs. And it basically just meant that the hazing tradition has rules now. It's a bit more regulated at that university, where it never was when Sanda lost his life. The new baptism charter includes things like announcing activities before they're allowed to go ahead, and they have to get them approved by the city of Leuven, or at least the students' organisations that oversee all of the fraternities. There's new rules that these newbies are not allowed to be forced to drink alcohol in excess, and the hazing tamer, the guy that leads the whole thing, they have to remain sober through the whole event just to make sure that nothing goes awry. But even with these new rules, it still doesn't bring any justice for Sanda Dia. I mean, it's a good thing for the future of that university, but it's too little too late. About a year and a half after Sanda's death, it was 2020. We were all in the pandemic, and the Black Lives Matter movement really boomed. After the tragic police murder of George Floyd in the US, every single country was protesting for Black lives to matter to everyone. These protests spreaded all over the world. Pretty much every country was doing them, and of course, so were Belgium. And Sanda Dia was one of the biggest faces of the movement in that country. But it wasn't just about Sanda, it was about every single Black life. Belgians took to the streets demanding that their country confront its brutal colonial past. Statues of King Leopold II were vandalised, destroyed, even pulled down and thrown into rivers. And like I say, in every single march in Belgium and in the Netherlands, it was hard to miss Sanda's face. He was on everyone's signs. He was one of the names that people were shouting. His story really highlighted the invisible struggles that people of colour in Belgium go through, the structural racism that they face every single day. In the aftermath of the horrific event of Sanda's death, the university gave the Reuzegom boys a light punishment, to say the least. Not one of them was suspended or expelled. All 18 members were allowed to continue with their studies almost like nothing had ever happened. The only punishment that they did get was that they had to do about 30 hours of community service, and they had to write a paper on the history of hazing. It's pathetic. That is the only word I can think to describe that. It is pitiful. Those boys' punishment lasted about the same amount of time as the time they took to torture Sanda Dia until he died. I'm sure you're thinking, Reuzegom cannot possibly continue after this. And I was thinking the same thing. It turns out the boys actually disbanded all by themselves. They weren't told to shut it down by the university. No one came in and stopped it. Yeah, they decided to disband. The university also promised that they would review every hazing practice that went ahead from that point in time. They would review it, not put a stop to it, just review them. The university's reaction to this case, or lack of reaction, should I say, it pissed off every single student in the whole of Belgium, in the whole of the Netherlands. Everyone was incredibly angry because they saw this as a huge injustice. Sanda's parents had lost their son. The whole world had lost this incredibly kind, intelligent, and bright soul. And the university had practically just let the Reuzegom boys get away with it. You know, they finished their studies, they sat their exams, they continued living their privileged lives like nothing ever happened. I think the university could tell that everyone was pissed off, and so they tried to make a stand, but this is going to really piss you off. So it was around the start of 2020. Pandemic times. They come out and say that all former Reuzegom boys are not allowed to enter any of the university buildings. As if anyone was entering the university buildings in the middle of the pandemic. That is not a punishment. The boys were still allowed to take their online classes, the same as every other student was during the pandemic. It's bullshit, honestly. It looked more like the uni was trying to be seen to do something. They were kind of protecting the boys rather than punishing them or giving any justice to Sanda. In a heartbreaking interview, Usman, Sanda's father, expressed his pain and confusion over KU Leuven's reaction to this whole thing. He couldn't understand why his son had to die, had to lose his life in the most horrific way possible, and there had to be this huge media frenzy and protests for the university to finally give a shit about the dangerous hazing practices that have gone on year after year after year for so long. Usman said, "I had a lot of faith in KU Leuven, wrongly. I sent my son there for a diploma, and I got a body back." And it was only made more and more painful for Usman and all of Sanda's family the more details came out about this case. You know, when they heard about the WhatsApp messages that were going on through the hazing, where one of them was like texting in the group chat saying that Sanda wasn't doing well, but the other ones were fine and they were keeping on going. All of it was reported in the media and in the news, and Sanda's family had to read every harrowing detail about how all 18 of these boys didn't give a shit if their son lived or died that day. And then, about a month after Sanda's death, there was a very shocking video found on one of the Reuzegom boys' phones. He and some of the other boys had gone up to a black man who appeared to be homeless. He was begging for money in the town. They took the hat off of his head. They were teasing him. And when the man just walked away from them, moved away, the boys started singing a racist song at him, the lyrics saying, "Cutting off the hands, the Congo is ours." And when you hear that the exact same boys that carried out the hazing on Sanda Dia were singing these racist songs and bullying this homeless person on the streets just a month later, it's hard not to believe that racism was the reason that all of this happened. These boys were disgustingly racist. It was just heartbreaking for everyone. They'd always kind of suspected that Sanda had been targeted because of his race, but when this video came out and showed just how shameless these boys were about their racism, it was practically confirmed. In 2023, 4 years after Sanda's death, the Reuzegom boys were finally brought to court to answer for their crimes. But as we've seen on this channel before actually, in these type of cases, when the rich and powerful join forces to protect themselves, real justice is almost impossible to achieve. All 18 members of the fraternity stood on trial and they could face up to 10 years in prison if they were found guilty. They all tried to hide their identities as they walked into court. They were wearing big hoodies and, hiding their face, wearing baseball hats with a big R on them. And you can probably guess that the R stands for Reuzegom, but it could just as easily stand for racist. 4 years after Sanda's death, after a bunch of delays, evidence collection, and even a change of judge, and remember, one of the boys' mums was a judge in that area, the final verdict was made on May 26th, 2023. The most serious charge against these boys was administering harmful substances resulting in death, but all 18 of them were found not guilty. The court decided that they were not responsible for giving Sanda the harmful substances that killed him. And the harmful substance that killed him was the fish oil that they forced him to drink. Make it make sense. The court found that the defendants weren't aware that drinking an excessive amount of fish oil could be so harmful. In fact, they said, fish oil is freely available in the store, and the bottle did not state anywhere that the intake of fish oil could cause serious medical consequences. And I think, okay, fine, if you're going to argue that, but how can you defend them making him sit in freezing cold water for hours, getting hypothermia, drinking so much alcohol that his liver could have just packed in on itself then and there? You can't defend everything with just ignorance. Also, none of the boys were found guilty of culpable neglect, which basically means not providing assistance and care to someone that is in great danger. If you see someone that needs help and you don't give them it out of your choice when you can help them, that is a crime. But the court found them all not guilty of that as well. They said that the defendants didn't realise that he was possibly in danger to his life. They argued that they didn't knowingly and intentionally refuse to provide the necessary medical assistance. In fact, they actually managed to argue that they did try to help Sanda, because as soon as they pulled him out of that water thing, yeah, they were kind of trying to help him. They put him in new clothes, they put him in the car with the heating on, they took him to hospital within an hour, and they tried to argue that they did their best. But in my opinion, it's too little too fucking late after making him sit in that water for hours and hours and hours. And let me remind you once again that one of these boys was a medical student. And I know he was just a student, he wasn't a fully, qualified doctor yet, but that is one dumbass future doctor if he couldn't tell how much serious danger Sanda Dia was in that day. He was literally passing out. He was unable to walk or talk. What kind of doctor would look at someone in that state and think, yeah, let's keep the hazing going? It's just another level of disturbing that a future doctor that people are supposed to trust with their lives found entertainment in watching another human being suffer like that. And I don't know where he is or what he's doing now, but it makes me sick to think that he probably still achieved that career of being a doctor, because well, none of them really got any consequences. I think it's just insane that the ruling was made, to say that the boys didn't realise how much danger Sanda was in. They were literally texting each other in the WhatsApp group chat saying, what were their exact words? Sanda was ready for the trash. So they were acknowledging that he was barely even functioning anymore. How can we argue that they were just ignorant? In the end, all 18 of the Reuzegom boys were held accountable for involuntary manslaughter, degrading treatment, and cruelty to animals. But none of them went to prison. None of them spent a single day behind bars. Instead, each of them were ordered to complete 200 to 300 hours of community service and to pay a fine, a penalty fee of $400. euros. And that is why earlier on in this episode I told you to pay special attention to when older, former Reuzegom boys had involved a piglet in their hazing rituals and killed it, and they'd been taken to court by these animal protection services, and they were ordered to pay a €400 fine for that, and the same fee, the same penalty amount was put on Sanda's life. They had to pay the same penalty fee for killing a pig and for torturing a human being for 48 hours relentlessly and watching the life drain out of his body. And to the court, that was only worth $400. Sanda Dia's life was worth the same as a pig. And let me remind you that for these boys, the Reuzegom boys from these rich, powerful, elite families, a €400 fine is pocket change. That's not even gonna make a dent in their fucking pocket money from daddy. What the court decided on that day is not justice in any way, shape or form for Sanda Dia or his family or the rest of the world that now don't get to bask in the light of this beautiful soul. After this very disappointing judgment came out, the streets of Belgium were absolutely flooded with students and, well, to be fair, everyone, not even just students, were affected by this. It upset the whole entire nation. Peaceful protesters gathered in their hundreds with signs up, just demanding justice for Sanda. They weren't causing any issues, they weren't being violent, they just wanted justice. How can a group of students seem to almost get away with murder like this? The answer is simple: class justice. Class justice means that the system favours one particular class of people over another class. And there's no doubt that these white, wealthy, old money fraternity boys knew how to manipulate the system to their benefit. They were armed with some of Belgium's top lawyers, and it's clear that they got favourable treatment because of their social status. But what if the roles were reversed? Imagine if it was an upper-class, rich, elite, white student that had tragically died in a hazing ritual that was run by a bunch of students from a migrant background. Would they have received such a lenient punishment? I highly doubt it. So many people were just infuriated by the court's decision, especially when it was announced that all 18 of those boys were going to have their identity protected. Well, all 18 of them would not appear on public criminal records. That means that no one would have to know that they were involved in this crime. In fact, their criminal records would only be available to the police, to the courts, and to the security services. Not to their future employers. They wouldn't have to tell, their future wife or anyone. No one has to know what these boys did when they were in uni. It's disgusting! And apparently the reason that was given as to why the boys didn't have to go on the public criminal record was because they didn't want to affect the boys' futures. Are you kidding me? Ooh, I'm gonna explode. What about Sanda's future? He doesn't get a future because of these boys. It would have been a future where he was gonna make a positive impact on this world. He was gonna make his father proud after he had sacrificed so much. I'm just so sick and tired of hearing about promising young men that get their crimes and their evil deeds covered up so that they can continue on like nothing ever happened. The outcome of this case just shows you that if you have the money and the connections, you'll probably be able to dodge the bullet, no matter how severe the crime. But the story doesn't end there. So the boys' names are obviously not in the public criminal record. In fact, Sanda's lawyer said that it would probably be easier to find a list of the names of secret agents as opposed to the Reuzegom boys. Obviously, Sanda's lawyer has never met YouTube researchers before. Leave it to us to scour the internet and find the names of these boys. Not me and my team. We didn't do this. But another guy, another YouTuber did, who honestly should be hired by the FBI at this point. In June 2023, a Flemish YouTuber named Hazed, his real name is Nathan, went on social media to condemn the court's ruling and to condemn these boys. To his 500,000 subscribers, Hazed posted a video revealing the names of all 18 of those Reuzegom boys. He felt so passionately about getting Sanda some form of justice, Hazed decided that he would do the right thing in his eyes. If the court wasn't going to do it, he would. So now those 18 boys were at the mercy of the internet and the court of public opinion. About 8 months later, however, Hazed was sued by the Reuzegom boys. They took him to court. He was found guilty. Hazed was given a 3-month suspended prison sentence. He was fined €800, double the amount what those Reuzegom boys were fined in the first place over Sanda's death. And it doesn't even stop there. Hazed was also ordered to pay €20,000 in damages to those 18 boys. Just when you think things can't get any more unfair, they do. Now those boys have made money from what they did to Sanda. After Hazed's court trial, Anami, Sanda's mother, wrote an open letter to the public that said, "This must stop. Sanda's soul must be able to rest. I understand all the reactions, the outrage, and calls for justice, but there are real people behind it. Behind the Sanda Dia depicted in the newspapers and on the screens is a real boy, an average Belgian boy." Even to this day, there are still so many unanswered questions when it comes to Sanda's death, but his story has shined a harsh light on how much racism still exists in Belgium. It shows that something needs to change in society and at these universities to prevent a tragedy like this from ever happening again. This was a crime of sick entertainment, but it was also a crime rooted in racism and classism. Sanda must have been so scared that day. He was barely conscious. He was clearly in serious trouble. I'm sure he was aware of that. It's hard not to think about if just one of those 18 boys had had a change of heart and been brave enough to say something and put a stop to this, then Sanda might have gotten the help he needed a little earlier, and he might still be alive today. By now, Sanda would have graduated uni and he would probably be on with all of his dreams and all of his goals, and especially that big goal that he had of making a positive impact on this world. And his family wanted to honour Sanda and his memory in a way that stayed true to this, that stayed true to his mission in life. And so they set up the Sanda Dia Foundation. The foundation aims to offer exchange programs for young people to be able to travel to Senegal and immerse themselves in the very rich culture over there. They believe that by experiencing different cultures and customs firsthand with your own eyes, people can become way more aware of the great wide world and all of the differences that we have, and therefore become more tolerant of others. For more information, you can check out the Foundation's website. Of course, we will have it linked in the description of this episode, and you can help to bring awareness to Sanda's case and to his legacy. Another really important charity that I wanted to highlight before I let you go is the Hazing Prevention Network, whose goal it is to create a world free of dangerous hazing rituals. Hazing incidents are not exclusive to Belgium. We've already talked about how they happen in pretty much all universities. In fact, some of the most well-known tragedies to come from hazing have happened in America. You can get involved by donating to the Hazing Prevention Network, or by petitioning to your own university or to your Congress to pass the Stop Campus Hazing Act. If you know someone that has suffered from hazing, or if you've even experienced it yourself, the Hazing Prevention Network also offers so many resources to help you get over it and to help you report it and to get some justice for yourself. Most universities actually have their own petitions to stop hazing, and so if you want to help make a change, I encourage you to look into what your own university does, what kind of petitions they have, to sign them, to make noise about them. All the links to the charities and resources that we've spoken about in this episode are going to be in the description. Please do use them, and I'm so sorry if you've gone through anything like this. For the past 5 years, Sanda's father, Usman, has stayed mostly silent about his son's death, but in 2024 he published a book named They Killed My Son, sharing his deepest feelings and experiences about what happened. The book is in Dutch, so, I mean, if you speak Dutch, please do go and pick up that book. It's so important and apparently very, very emotional. I personally don't speak Dutch, but our researcher does. I have a lot of friends that speak Dutch. I'm going to be passing this book around like crazy this week. Sanda's story is just one of many that show the constant injustice in our system. Racism continues to play a huge role in every institution and in people's daily lives. While justice may officially, in the eyes of the law, been served by the courts, Sanda Dia was made to suffer injustice. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I don't know if you can tell, but this has been one that myself and the whole entire team have felt so strongly about. I know it was so heavy, but it's one that needs to be talked about. I don't think I've ever done a case surrounding hazing before, but in researching this one, we found so many more that we do want to talk about. So if this has been a topic that interests you or a topic that makes you want to do something, to get out there and to cause change, then I'm glad. I'm very glad. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here with me today to cover this case. And thank you so much to NordVPN for sponsoring this episode. Remember, they've got an exclusive deal for you guys, my followers, when you go to nordvpn.com/Eleanor. The link is down below in the description. Right now, every purchase of a 2-year plan will come with 4 bonus months for free, plus a Saily data voucher up to 20 gigabytes. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to watch another one of ours, there should be one on screen right now. Go click it and I'll see you there. Or if you want to subscribe to my channel, you can click the circle with my face in. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you never miss when we post a new episode. Leave a like, leave a comment, share with a friend, share these petitions everywhere that you can, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye!